When I agreed to take care of Joanne, I never imagined it would be the beginning of everything falling apart. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had always been the one to sacrifice for my family. But the moment Margaret and David walked out the door, leaving me alone with her, everything changed. As they turned their backs, promising to be gone for a weekend, I was left alone with her, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. For months, they told me Joanne had been in a coma, barely hanging on. They made me believe she was nothing but a shell of a person. But something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played. The house was eerily quiet as the front door clicked shut behind them. Margaret, with her cool smile, handed me the responsibility without a second thought, and David, her ever-present shadow, barely spared me a glance. I stood there for a moment, watching them drive off, the weight of their words settling heavily on me. They didn't care. They didn't care that I had given up everything for them. I had spent years looking after my family, supporting my son and his wife, but this was different. This time, I felt it. I felt the emptiness of their departure. The silence in the house was deafening. I walked slowly into the living room, glancing at Joanne, still lying motionless in her bed. The quiet was only broken by the occasional creak of the house settling, a sound I had grown accustomed to. I sat beside Joanne's bed, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the blanket around her frail body. Her skin was cold, almost lifeless, and her breathing, shallow, seemed to be the only proof that she was still here. The doctors said there was no hope. They said she couldn't hear, couldn't respond. But something told me otherwise. As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Margaret had handed me this task, as if it were a burden she was happy to offload. Her cold eyes met mine for just a second before she and David left, and in that moment, I felt more alone than ever. But as the clock continued its relentless ticking, something changed. A flicker in Joanne's eyes. At first, I thought I imagined it. Maybe it was the light, the shadows, playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again. A slow, almost imperceptible blink. My heart skipped a beat. Joanne's eyes, once closed for months, now moved. She wasn't unconscious. She was aware. The realization hit me like a wave, and I froze, not sure if I should be scared or relieved. But then Joanne's eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time in months, her gaze met mine. The room felt like it was closing in on me, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to comprehend what was happening. She was awake. She was aware. I sat there, staring at her, as she blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the world around her. Her lips parted, and she whispered something barely audible. "They think I'm gone." Her voice was faint, but the words were clear. "They think I don't know." My mind raced as I tried to understand what was happening. Joanne had been pretending to be comatose for months. She had been conscious this whole time, and now, finally, she was speaking. I didn't know what to do with this information. How could I? For months, I had been told she was incapable of understanding anything. Yet here she was, fully aware. And worse, she had been listening to everything. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Joanne, what do you mean?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Joanne's eyes locked with mine, a look of determination in her gaze. "I've been waiting," she said slowly, her voice still weak but full of meaning. "Waiting to see how far they would go, how far they would push me." The words sank in like a weight, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. What had I walked into? What had they done to her? Joanne wasn't just a victim of a medical condition. She had been living in a nightmare of her own, a nightmare of betrayal. She had been lying there, pretending to be unconscious, while her daughter and son-in-law carried on with their lives, uncaring and manipulative. And now, the truth was coming to light. I had never imagined it would be like this. But the more Joanne spoke, the clearer it became. They had thought she was weak. They had thought they could take advantage of her without her ever knowing. But Joanne wasn't weak. And now she was awake. Now, she was ready to fight. And somehow so was I. As I sat there beside Joanne, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding, something I wasn't ready for. She had been silent for so long. But now, she was speaking, and every word she uttered felt like a weight pressing down on me. "I've been waiting," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, but clear enough to cut through the thick silence. "Waiting for them to show their true colors." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to process what Joanne was revealing. She had been awake all this time, lying in that bed, pretending to be unconscious while her daughter, Margaret, and her husband, David, had been going about their lives as if nothing had changed. They had thought she was nothing more than a helpless, comatose woman, but Joanne was far from helpless. The realization hit me hard, like a wave crashing over me. For months, I had been told she was beyond reach, unable to communicate, unable to understand anything happening around her. But now, it seemed like she had been fully aware of everything. Everything Margaret and David had done, everything they had said, every subtle manipulation. And she had been waiting for the right moment to reveal it all. "They've been using me," Joanne continued, her voice shaky but steady. "They thought I didn't know, thought I couldn't hear them. But I've been listening all these months." The words sent a chill through me. I didn't know what to think or feel. Joanne's daughter and son-in-law had treated her like a pawn in their game. They had assumed she would never wake up, never question their actions, never realize how they had been treating her. They had been getting away with it, taking advantage of her vulnerability while she lay there, pretending to be lifeless. But now, Joanne was awake, and she wasn't going to let them continue. I could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had been hidden behind the mask of silence. She had been pretending to be powerless, but she wasn't. And now, she was ready to fight back. I sat there, stunned, as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. I had been taking care of Joanne, following Margaret's instructions, not questioning anything. But now, everything was different. The roles had reversed. Joanne was no longer the helpless patient. She was the one in control, and I was no longer just a caretaker. I was part of the story, whether I liked it or not. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joanne's eyes met mine, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm going to make them regret it," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I've been quiet for too long. But not anymore." The determination in her voice sent a shiver down my spine. I had no idea what she had planned, but I could sense the power in her words. It was clear now that Joanne wasn't just going to lie there and be mistreated. She was going to take back control, and she wasn't going to let Margaret and David get away with what they had done. I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, awe, and a growing sense of solidarity with Joanne. I had spent so many years living in the shadow of my family, always putting their needs before my own. But in that moment, I realized that Joanne had been doing the same thing. She had sacrificed so much for her daughter, her family, but now she was done. I was done too. I wasn't going to keep quiet anymore, not if it meant letting them continue their cruelty. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew I had to be ready. Joanne had made her decision, and now it was time for me to make mine. As I looked at her, I saw a woman who had been wronged but was determined to fight for what was right. And in that moment, I knew I would stand by her, no matter what happened next. As I sat beside Joanne, the room felt strangely heavy, the silence between us almost unbearable. The weight of her words still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreversible. Joanne wasn't the frail, helpless woman they had made her out to be. She was strong, more aware than anyone could have imagined, and now that the truth was out, I wasn't sure how to handle it. The clock ticked loudly in the background, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours as we sat there, just the two of us in that dimly lit room. Joanne's voice had a quiet strength, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I've waited for them to show their true faces," she whispered again, her eyes locked on mine. "And now I see it. They think I don't know, but I know everything." My heart raced as I processed the weight of what she was saying. All those months of pretending, all those hours of silence, and for what? So that they could take advantage of her? So that Margaret and David could continue their manipulation without fear of repercussions? I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was still in shock, unsure if I had heard her right. Was this really happening? Was Joanne really awake? And was she really telling me that she had been aware of everything all along? I glanced at her, trying to understand the depth of her pain, but there was something else in her eyes too. Something sharp, something that told me she wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. She was done being the silent victim. She was done being the one who took the fall for everything. "What will you do now?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joanne took a deep breath, her frail chest rising and falling as she gathered her thoughts. "I'm going to take control," she said, her voice steady. "I've been silent for too long. I've let them think they could push me aside, but not anymore. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a rush of emotion I hadn't expected. Here was a woman who had been through so much, a woman who had spent months in a state of semi-consciousness, yet now, when she had every reason to feel defeated, she was choosing to fight. There was something powerful in that decision, something inspiring. As I sat there, trying to wrap my mind around everything that had just been revealed, I began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Joanne wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the truth. She was fighting for justice, for the dignity that had been taken from her. And I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't just going to be a bystander anymore. I wasn't going to sit back and let Margaret and David continue their charade. Joanne had awakened, not just from her coma, but from the life they had tried to trap her in. And I was going to help her, no matter what. What do you need me to do? I asked, my voice firm, my resolve growing stronger with each passing second. Joanne looked at me, a faint smile crossing her lips. You don't need to do anything, she said. I'll take care of it. But I need you to stand by me, to be my witness. I nodded, not knowing exactly what was coming next, but understanding the weight of the responsibility she was placing on me. I had no idea what plans Joanne had in mind, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be easy. Margaret and David had spent months, maybe even years, getting away with their manipulation. And now, everything was about to change. Joanne wasn't going to let them win. And neither was I. As the hours passed, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. I kept thinking about all the times I had been there, all the times I had helped Margaret and David without asking questions. How had I been so blind? How had I let them walk all over me, all over Joanne? But I couldn't change the past. What mattered now was what came next. And what came next was going to be a reckoning. Joanne had been silent for far too long, but now, her voice would be heard. And I would be there to support her, no matter what happened. The clock ticked on, but I felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just going to sit by and watch as my family tore itself apart. I was going to stand up for what was right. And together, Joanne and I would make sure that Margaret and David would never take advantage of us again. The next few days passed in a blur. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't stop thinking about everything Joanne had said. I had never imagined she would be awake, let alone aware of everything going on around her. And yet, there she was, determined to take control of her life again. I had no idea what her plans were, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Margaret and David get away with their manipulation. I spent my days in the house, quietly observing, as Joanne rested and recovered, her strength slowly returning with each passing hour. She wasn't the same woman she had been before. She had a quiet fire in her now, an energy that made me believe she could take on anything, even the people who had tried to destroy her. I spent hours sitting with her, listening to her talk about her life, her family, and the betrayal she had endured. She had always been the pillar of her family, the one everyone leaned on. But for too long, Margaret and David had used her as if she were nothing more than a tool. It broke my heart to hear her talk about the things they said behind her back, the way they took advantage of her kindness. But what struck me the most was how calm she was. She had been betrayed by the people she loved most, but she wasn't angry. No, she was focused. And she was ready. I've been patient, she told me one afternoon as we sat together in the living room. But patience only gets you so far. Now, I'm ready to fight for what's mine. It was those words that made me realize something. Joanne wasn't just fighting for her house or her money. She was fighting for her dignity. She was fighting to show Margaret and David that they couldn't just push her aside anymore. She was going to take back her life, and nothing was going to stop her. I was still trying to process everything she had told me, trying to understand how we could confront Margaret and David without causing more chaos. But Joanne seemed calm and sure. She knew exactly what she was doing. I had to trust her. Margaret and David had left her for dead, both literally and figuratively, and now they would pay the price for their actions. But that wasn't something Joanne was going to do out of anger or vengeance. No, she was going to do it because she deserved to be treated with respect. As the days went on, I began to notice subtle changes in the way Joanne carried herself. She was more confident, more determined, as if every day brought her closer to the moment when she would finally confront Margaret and David. I was amazed by how strong she was, even in the face of everything they had done. It made me think about my own life. about how I had let myself be pushed aside, how I had let others dictate my worth. But I wasn't like Joanne. I hadn't been betrayed by the people I loved most. And yet, something in me began to stir. Maybe it was her strength, her unwavering belief that she could take back control. Or maybe it was the realization that I had been complicit in my own silence. I had let my family take advantage of me for too long. But now, like Joanne, I was ready to take control of my own life. The days grew closer to the moment when Margaret and David would return, and I could feel the tension building in the air. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I knew that Joanne was ready. I could only hope I would be able to support her in the way she needed. Joanne had made her decision. She was no longer going to be the victim. She was going to take back what was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just helping her anymore. I was standing by her as a witness to her strength, as someone who had finally found the courage to fight back against the manipulation and lies. Margaret and David had no idea what they were about to walk into. It was the day Margaret and David were scheduled to return, and I could feel the tension building. Every inch of the house seemed to hum with anticipation. I was standing in the kitchen, nervously wiping my hands on a dish towel, when I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I glanced at Joanne, who was sitting in the living room, a calm but resolute expression on her face. Her transformation was almost surreal. She had gone from being the quiet, resigned figure in her bed to this powerful woman, ready to reclaim what was taken from her. I knew she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the years she had spent being invisible to her own family. She was fighting to remind them that she mattered. As I looked at her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She wasn't afraid anymore. In the past, she would have let Margaret and David walk all over her, but not today. Today, they were going to see her for who she really was. I heard the door open, followed by the sound of their voices as they stepped inside, laughing and talking, completely unaware of the storm waiting for them. Margaret's voice carried through the house, sharp and familiar. "We're back," she called out, her tone carefree. "Did everything go smoothly?" Her voice faltered slightly when she saw Joanne sitting in the living room. It wasn't the look of surprise that caught my attention. It was the quick flash of guilt that passed across her face. David entered behind her, his eyes scanning the room. They were both trying to act casual, but I could sense the unease beneath the surface. Joanne didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched them, her gaze steady and unwavering. Margaret stood still for a moment, her eyes narrowing, but then she composed herself and forced a smile. "So, Joanne," she said, walking into the room and sitting down across from her mother. "How was your time alone? Everything okay?" Joanne remained silent for a few seconds before responding, her voice soft but laced with a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "I've been waiting," she said, her words slow and deliberate. Margaret's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her eyes darting to David, who seemed just as uncomfortable as she did. "Waiting for what?" Margaret asked, her voice a little too sharp. Joanne didn't answer immediately. She simply met Margaret's gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet fury that made Margaret shift in her seat. "Waiting to see who you really are," Joanne replied calmly. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Margaret's face paled, and I could see her trying to regain control, but something in the air had shifted. David, standing by the doorway, looked back and forth between his wife and mother, his expression hardening. He wasn't used to seeing Joanne like this. He had always seen her as weak, as someone who would never challenge him or Margaret. But Joanne wasn't backing down anymore. "What are you talking about?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly now. Joanne's voice was steady, unwavering. "I know everything. I've heard the things you've said. I know how you've treated me. I've been listening, even when you thought I couldn't hear." Margaret's eyes widened, and I could see the panic begin to creep into her features. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared for Joanne to fight back, to confront her in this way. "You're lying," Margaret said quickly, her voice cracking. "You couldn't have heard anything. You've been in a coma." Joanne shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "No, I haven't," she replied, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I've been awake for a long time, just waiting. Waiting to see how far you would push me." The silence that followed was thick, the weight of Joanne's words sinking in. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to react. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to be losing control. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, standing up abruptly. "You've lost your mind, Joanne. You can't just say things like that." Joanne remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm not crazy," she said quietly. "But you and David have been using me, manipulating me. You thought I was too weak to notice, too weak to care. But I've been watching. And now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The room was heavy with silence after that. I could feel the tension in the air, the rising unease that only grew with every word. Margaret's face was red with frustration, and David's jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed. Joanne had exposed them. She had pulled back the curtain on their deceit, and they didn't know how to handle it. They had spent so long hiding behind the lie that Joanne was helpless, that they could do whatever they wanted without fear of her response. But now, that was over. Joanne was standing her ground, and Margaret and David could no longer hide behind their manipulations. "I'm done," Joanne said finally, her voice steady. "And you should be too." The finality in her words hung in the air like a sentence. Margaret and David were silent now, unsure of how to proceed, unsure of how to handle this new reality. Joanne had spoken her truth, and there was no going back. And as I looked at her, I realized that this was just the beginning. Margaret and David may have thought they could walk away unscathed, but Joanne wasn't going to let them. She was done being their victim. And I was right there beside her, ready to fight for what was right. The days after Joanne's confrontation with Margaret and David felt like they were suspended in time, each moment stretching out longer than the last. The house, once filled with tension, now felt almost hollow, like the calm before a storm. Joanne had made her move. She had told the truth, and now there was no turning back. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I could feel the shift in the air. Margaret and David had left that day, their faces tight with anger and confusion, but something in me told me they were just getting started. They weren't the type of people to let this go quietly, and neither was Joanne. The next morning, after they had left, Joanne called me into the living room. She was sitting there, her posture as straight as I had ever seen it. There was a quiet determination in her eyes, the same eyes that had once been filled with uncertainty. "We need to prepare," Joanne said, her voice steady. "They will try to take what's mine, what's rightfully mine." I sat down across from her, the weight of her words sinking in. What did she mean by prepare? Joanne had been very clear about one thing. This wasn't over. She had spent too long being silent, too long letting others walk over her. But now, she was taking control. And that meant she wasn't just going to let Margaret and David waltz back into her life and pretend everything was fine. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice a little uncertain. Joanne looked at me, her gaze sharp. "We make sure they know I won't back down. We make sure they know the consequences of what they've done." I didn't fully understand what she meant at that moment, but as the days passed, it became clear. Joanne wasn't just planning to confront Margaret and David. She was preparing for something bigger. She started making phone calls, talking to lawyers, and pulling together the pieces of her life that she had let slip through her fingers for far too long. She was fighting for more than just her house. She was fighting for her independence, her dignity, and her right to be heard. The phone calls with the lawyer were quiet but intense. Joanne would nod at certain things, take notes, and then hang up with a resolve that seemed to grow stronger by the hour. I started to see her in a different light. This was the woman who had been invisible to her family for years, but now, she was taking charge. I watched as she transformed before my eyes. No longer was she the frail, sick woman lying in bed. She was standing tall, ready to face the people who had underestimated her. I could see the determination in her eyes. Joanne wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. And she wasn't going to let Margaret and David win. It wasn't long before I started to feel the weight of her plan. She had been patient for so long, but now it was time for her to take action. The phone calls turned into meetings. The meetings turned into documents. The documents turned into plans that would change everything. Joanne wasn't just going to sit by and let her family destroy her life anymore. She was going to take back control, and she was going to make sure Margaret and David understood the consequences of their actions. I knew what she was doing, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. Margaret and David were used to getting their way. They were used to manipulating people to get what they wanted. But they didn't know Joanne the way I did. They didn't know the woman who had been silently watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike back. As the days passed, I couldn't help but admire her strength. I had always thought of Joanne as a quiet, reserved woman who had spent her life taking care of everyone else. But now, I was seeing a side of her I had never known existed, a side that was brave, determined, and ready to fight for what was hers. It made me wonder about my own life. How many times had I let people walk all over me? How many times had I stayed silent when I should have spoken up? Joanne had given me the courage to find my own voice, to stand up for myself and for what I believed in. And as I watched her take charge of her future, I realized I wasn't just standing by her side as a witness. I was standing with her as a partner in this fight. Joanne was done being the victim. She was done being the one left behind. And I wasn't going to let her do it alone. The time for silence was over. The time for action was now. The days leading up to the meeting with the lawyer were filled with an air of quiet anticipation. Joanne was in full control now, and every movement she made seemed to reflect that newfound power. Her resolve was unwavering. The woman I had known as fragile and dependent had become someone completely different. Every morning, she would sit at the kitchen table, papers and legal documents spread before her, making calls, taking notes, and organizing everything with a precision I had never seen before. I watched her from the doorway, in awe of how strong she had become. She was no longer just the woman who had silently accepted her family's neglect. She was someone who was ready to take back everything they had taken from her. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't even just about the money. Joanne's fight had become a fight for dignity, for respect, for her right to be seen as more than just a burden. She was done being treated like an afterthought. I started to understand why she had waited so long. She wasn't just playing a waiting game. She was watching, listening, and planning. Every action she had taken, every decision she made, was carefully calculated. She was smarter than they gave her credit for. She had been playing the long game, and now it was her time to win. When the day finally came for us to meet with the lawyer, I could feel the weight of the moment in the air. We had arranged everything in advance, and I could sense that Joanne was ready for whatever came next. As we sat in the lawyer's office, the tension was palpable. Joanne sat across from the lawyer, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She was simply ready. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, began going over the details of Joanne's case. As he spoke, I could see. Her eyes light up with every word he said, like a light bulb going off in her head. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. As the lawyer handed her the documents, Joanne took a deep breath and signed her name with confidence. I could see the weight lifting from her shoulders. This wasn't just about winning. This was about taking control of her life again. She wasn't just going to let Margaret and David walk away with everything they had taken from her. She was going to stand her ground. After the meeting, as we were walking back to the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Joanne had changed. She had become someone else entirely. She was no longer the quiet, passive woman who had let her family walk all over her. She was a force to be reckoned with, and I was proud to be standing by her side. That night, Joanne and I sat in the living room together, reflecting on everything that had happened. "I can't believe it's finally happening," I said, my voice filled with wonder. "I never imagined you'd be able to do this." Joanne smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I've always been capable," she said quietly. "I just had to remind myself of that." It was then that I realized something. This wasn't just about the house, or the money, or the betrayal. This was about Joanne rediscovering herself, her strength, and her worth. She had spent so many years hiding behind her role as a caretaker, putting everyone else's needs above her own. But now, she was putting herself first. And that was something I hadn't seen in her before. I had always thought of Joanne as someone who had lived her life for everyone else. But now, I saw a woman who was finally living for herself. A woman who wasn't afraid to fight for what she deserved. And I knew, in that moment, that no matter what happened next, Joanne was going to be okay. Margaret and David might have underestimated her, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. She had found her voice, and she was ready to use it. As we sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened slowly sinking in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Joanne wasn't just my friend. She was a survivor, a fighter, and now, she was a woman who was going to take back what was hers. The next few weeks felt like a slow burn. Joanne had done everything she needed to do, and now it was just a matter of time before Margaret and David would have to face the consequences of their actions. Every day, I could see Joanne growing stronger, more determined. She no longer sat quietly in the background. She was in control of her own life now, and it showed in every word she spoke, every action she took. But with each passing day, I could feel the tension rising. I knew it was only a matter of time before Margaret and David would try to fight back. They were used to getting their way. They were used to manipulating everyone around them. But they had no idea what they were up against now. Joanne wasn't going to let them control her any longer. One afternoon, I found myself sitting with Joanne in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in front of me, as we discussed the next steps. We had been talking about everything for weeks now. Her plans, the lawyer's advice, the inevitable confrontation that was coming. But it still felt surreal. Do you think they'll try to make this difficult? I asked, my voice laced with concern. Joanne looked at me, her eyes calm and steady. They'll try, but it won't work. I've prepared for everything. They think they can intimidate me, but they don't know who they're dealing with. Her words were quiet, but they were full of conviction. Joanne had thought about every possible outcome, every angle. She had been patient for so long, and now, she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. I was amazed by her strength. It wasn't just her physical health that had improved, but her entire demeanor had shifted. Joanne had always been a quiet, reserved woman, but now, she was like a force of nature. She wasn't afraid of Margaret and David anymore. And neither was I. That night, I sat up late, my mind racing. I couldn't help but think about everything Joanne had been through. All those years of being ignored, being dismissed as weak, as nothing more than a caretaker. All those years of putting everyone else's needs before her own. But now everything had changed. Joanne was no longer just a woman on the sidelines. She was taking control of her life, and I was right there beside her. When Margaret and David finally returned, I knew things were going to get tense. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. The moment they walked through the door, I could see the anger on their faces. They hadn't expected Joanne to stand up to them. They hadn't expected her to fight back. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, you think you can just take everything from us, Joanne?" she sneered. "You think we'll let you get away with this?" Joanne didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply looked at Margaret, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need your permission," she said softly. "This is about what's right. This is about me finally standing up for myself." Margaret's face turned red with frustration, but Joanne didn't look away. She was calm, composed, and in control. David, standing behind Margaret, was silent, his jaw clenched tightly. He wasn't used to seeing Joanne like this. He wasn't used to seeing her fight back. But Joanne wasn't the same woman she had been before. She had changed. And now, it was their turn to face the consequences of their actions. "You can't do this," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're just a frail old woman who's trying to ruin everything we've worked for." Joanne stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, measured. "I'm not frail," she said quietly. "And I'm not going anywhere. This is my life, Margaret. And I'm taking it back." There was a long pause as Margaret and David processed what Joanne had just said. They hadn't expected her to stand her ground, and they didn't know how to respond. But Joanne wasn't giving in. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her anymore. "This isn't over," David said finally, his voice low and cold. "We'll make sure you regret this." Joanne smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You're welcome to try," she said. With that, Margaret and David turned and stormed out of the room, their footsteps heavy with defeat. Joanne watched them leave, her expression unreadable. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a start. Joanne had done what she needed to do, and now, the rest of the world would have to catch up. I sat there, watching her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Joanne had found her voice, and there was no going back. Margaret and David could no longer control her. The fight wasn't over, but Joanne had already won the most important battle. She had taken control of her life, and nothing could take that away from her. Weeks passed, and Joanne's strength only grew. Each day, I saw her becoming more resolute, more like the woman she had always been, before all the silence, before the manipulation. I had started to believe in her plan, in her vision for reclaiming what was rightfully hers. It wasn't just about the house, or the money, or the vindication. This was about her standing up for herself, for her dignity, for the respect she deserved all along. The confrontation with Margaret and David had only been the beginning. and I could feel the storm still brewing beneath the surface. Joanne had made it clear that this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about putting an end to the way they had treated her, about making sure they would never try to take advantage of anyone again. She had prepared herself for a long fight. The next chapter began when Joanne received a letter from the lawyer. It was an official document that would change everything. The lawyer had managed to secure a court date, and it was clear that Margaret and David were not prepared for what was coming. When Joanne showed me the letter, her eyes gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. "This is it," she said, holding the paper in her hands. "This is my chance to show them who they're really dealing with." That was the moment everything felt real. Joanne was no longer playing defense. She was taking the offensive, and there was no turning back. Margaret and David were going to have to face the consequences of their actions. As the days grew closer to the court date, Joanne's confidence only grew. I had seen her shift from being the woman who had been discarded and overlooked to a woman with fire in her eyes, ready to face her adversaries head-on. She no longer doubted herself. The woman sitting before me, the woman who was preparing for battle, was unrecognizable from the woman who had once been pushed to the margins of her own family. It was an inspiring transformation. The night before the court date, I could tell Joanne was nervous, though she didn't show it. She sat in the living room, carefully organizing the papers she would need, ensuring everything was in order. I had never seen her so focused, so determined. It was like the weight of everything she had been through had built up to this moment, and she was ready to release it all. "I'm ready," she said softly, not looking up from the papers. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm going to make sure they hear me. They're going to understand just how wrong they were." I nodded, knowing there was nothing left to say. Joanne had done everything she could. Tomorrow was about the truth, about standing in the light after years of being kept in the shadows. The next morning, we arrived at the courthouse. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the tension in my chest as we stepped through the doors. Joanne was calm, but I could sense the energy coming from her. She was ready. When Margaret and David walked in, the room shifted. They were both trying to act nonchalant, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They hadn't expected Joanne to take this step. They hadn't expected her to fight back. Joanne was no longer the woman they could ignore. The hearing began, and I watched as Joanne took the stand. Her voice was steady, her words measured, but there was a power behind them that commanded attention. She spoke of the years of neglect, the times when her family had ignored her, and the way she had been made to feel like a burden. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, every word landing with purpose. Margaret and David didn't speak, not even trying to interrupt her. They couldn't. They knew the truth was on Joanne's side. As the hearing went on, I saw the cracks in their armor. They tried to put up a fight, but it was clear that Joanne had done her homework, and there was no escaping the truth now. She had prepared for this moment, and everything she had fought for, every sleepless night, and every lonely day, had led to this. When the judge finally made their ruling, I could see the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Margaret and David's fate had been sealed. Joanne had won. The relief that washed over her was palpable. She had fought for herself, and she had won. The battle had been long, and the road had been hard, but she had proven to herself, and to her family, that she was no longer going to let anyone dictate her worth. As we left the courthouse, Joanne turned to me, a small but genuine smile on her face. "I did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I finally did it." And in that moment, I realized that this victory was not just for Joanne. It was for anyone who had ever been silenced, for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. Joanne had shown me that it was never too late to take control of your life. It was never too late to stand up for yourself. And most importantly, it was never too late to be seen. She had made sure of that, and she had made sure they would never forget her again.